Misuse of authority against vulnerable individuals is one of the most visible and disturbing failures in modern law enforcement culture. When power is handed to someone through a badge, a gun, and the authority to decide what constitutes a threat, that power carries a responsibility to exercise judgment, restraint, and humanity. Yet too often, these moments reveal a gap between the promise of protection and the reality of force. A disabled veteran walking across a highway doesn't sound like a public threat. It sounds like a man trying to get to the other side of the road. But in that instant, when an officer reaches for a taser instead of stepping forward with understanding, the power dynamic becomes painfully clear. The misuse of authority begins when perception overrides reality. When an officer sees noncompliance instead of confusion, defiance instead of disability, danger instead of distress. It's not always about hatred or malice. Sometimes it's fear, sometimes impatience, sometimes the mechanical reflex of someone trained to control rather than to connect. But the result is the same. A person who poses no threat ends up treated as one. A flash of voltage, a body on the ground, and another video that travels across the internet faster than the officer's report can be written. The system moves slowly, but outrage moves instantly. This kind of incident strips the word serve of its meaning. Law enforcement is supposed to serve the community, yet when those sworn to protect default to force over empathy, that trust collapses. The most vulnerable, the disabled, the poor, the mentally ill, the elderly, become the easiest targets for overreach because they often can't comply quickly, can't communicate clearly, or simply don't fit the expected pattern of obedience. When authority stops recognizing vulnerability as something to safeguard and starts reading it as resistance, the entire concept of justice erodes. Every misuse of authority creates a ripple beyond the moment itself. It sends a message to the public that compliance is survival and vulnerability is risk. It teaches the next generation that authority isn't earned through respect, but through fear. That message hardens people, divides communities, and fuels the perception that law enforcement operates on power, not principle. When that happens, the badge becomes less a symbol of safety and more a reminder of imbalance. And once that trust breaks, it's almost impossible to repair. There's also a human cost on both sides of the badge. For the victim, the trauma is immediate and visible. The shock, the humiliation, the physical pain, the sense of being dehumanized in public view. For the officer, though less obvious, the cost is moral corrosion. Every unnecessary act of aggression chips away at empathy, at conscience, at the ability to see people as people. That corrosion spreads through departments like Rust, normalizing behavior that should be unthinkable. Officers learn from what they see, and when misconduct goes unchecked or excused, it breeds more of the same. The misuse of authority isn't just a single bad decision. It's a symptom of a deeper institutional mindset that prioritizes control over understanding. Police training often emphasizes command presence, officer safety, and quick dominance of situations, concepts that make sense in high-risk scenarios but turn dangerous when applied indiscriminately. The system rarely teaches how to read fear in someone's eyes, how to distinguish confusion from defiance, or how to step back when escalation serves no purpose. The veteran crossing the highway wasn't a threat. He was a man navigating life with wounds, visible and invisible. Recognizing that difference could have changed everything. What makes the misuse of authority so insidious is that it's often justified under the language of procedure. He didn't comply. I feared for my safety. He wasn't following commands. These phrases are used like armor, protecting officers from accountability while erasing the humanity of those they harm. The reports focus on actions, not reasons, on policy, not perspective. The truth becomes buried beneath official language until public outrage digs it up. And once the public sees the footage, the man falling after the taser crackles, the limp body, the indifferent stance, the damage is already done. For many, authority should mean responsibility, not domination. It should mean the strength to protect, not the license to punish. But when authority is misused, it becomes a mirror reflecting the worst instincts of control: fear masquerading as strength, pride masking insecurity, aggression disguising incompetence. It exposes the fragility of systems that rely on unchecked power and the arrogance of those who forget that authority exists only with the consent of the governed. Vulnerable individuals, by definition, depend on that consent and protection. They are the test of how humane a system really is. When a disabled veteran becomes the target of state power, it's not just an individual failure. It's a reflection of cultural decay and how authority perceives vulnerability. It's the moment when the protector becomes the aggressor and the uniform loses its meaning. And when society witnesses it, what begins as a single act of misconduct becomes a question that echoes far beyond one highway, one officer, or one man on the ground. The power of solidarity within the military community runs deeper than uniforms or shared missions. It is an unspoken bond built from shared hardship, discipline, and sacrifice. When someone who wore the same uniform is mistreated or disrespected, especially by authority, that bond activates almost instinctively. Soldiers, veterans, and service members don't see it as someone else's problem. They see it as their own. That instinct is what gives military solidarity its strength. It doesn't need to be organized or ordered. It emerges naturally, like muscle memory. When a disabled veteran was tossed while crossing a highway, that instinct woke up fast. Minutes later, the sound of heavy engines rolling in wasn't coincidence. It was connection in motion. The military community operates on loyalty, not just to the flag or to the country, but to each other. That loyalty is forged in environments where trust can mean survival. It's not about friendship in the casual sense. It's about knowing that the person next to you will be there when things fall apart. That kind of trust doesn't disappear when uniforms come off or when service ends. It lingers, binding people across states, generations, and branches. When injustice touches one of their own, it hits the entire network, igniting something primal, a defense mechanism rooted in respect and shared struggle. In moments of public injustice involving veterans, that solidarity becomes visible. It turns silent anger into collective action. The convoy that stopped traffic wasn't about confrontation. It was about presence. It was a statement that said, "You will not disrespect one of ours." It wasn't orchestrated by a chain of command or fueled by politics. It was the natural outcome of a shared identity reacting to an insult against one of its members. That moment when trucks lined up, engines humming, was less about defiance and more about protection, a reminder that even outside the battlefield, no one stands alone. The power in this unity lies in its credibility. Society often sees the military as disciplined, controlled, and mission-driven. So when that same community mobilizes emotionally, it sends a message that something has truly crossed the line. It's not outrage for attention, it's outrage with weight. That weight changes the public's perception, transforming a story from another police incident into a national conversation about honor, dignity, and loyalty. The sight of soldiers standing in solidarity with a disabled veteran reframes the narrative. It demands respect in a way no speech or press release ever could. The solidarity within the military is also rooted in empathy. Every service member knows what it feels like to be vulnerable, to rely on others for protection, to face danger, to come home carrying visible or invisible scars. That shared experience builds a deep understanding of struggle. When a veteran is mistreated, it doesn't just offend the group, it triggers a sense of betrayal. Because the same system that once demanded sacrifice now stands by while one of its own is harmed. The convoy's response wasn't only about anger. It was about grief and responsibility, a need to show that the brotherhood still protects its own, even when institutions fail to. There's also a moral authority that comes from this solidarity. Veterans often carry public respect that few other groups command. Their presence shifts the moral balance of a situation. When they step forward, people pay attention. The convoy's act of blocking traffic wasn't an act of rebellion. It was a living symbol of values the military instills: honor, respect, and unity. It reminded everyone watching that these values don't fade when the uniform is folded away. They live on in the actions of those who remember what service truly means. The military community's solidarity is not about aggression, it's about accountability. It reminds the public that real strength isn't measured in force, but in protection. Soldiers are trained to defend the weak, to maintain order, and to act with discipline even under chaos. When that same discipline is turned toward demanding justice for one of their own, it reveals the contrast between those who use power responsibly and those who abuse it. The image of soldiers standing guard over a wronged veteran becomes more than a protest. It becomes a moral checkpoint for society. Injustice against a veteran hits differently because it cuts through layers of national identity. Veterans are symbols of sacrifice, embodiments of national service. When one is harmed, especially in a way that shows disregard for their humanity, it shakes the foundation of respect people have for authority. That's why the military community reacts so fiercely. It's not just personal loyalty, it's defense of a principle that those who serve deserve dignity, not violence. The power of solidarity turns that principle from sentiment into action. This unity also exposes a contrast between institutional systems and human bonds. Where bureaucracy hesitates, solidarity moves. Where policy debates, loyalty acts. It's an instinctive justice that fills the void when official systems fail to protect those they should. The convoy that stopped traffic wasn't following protocol, it was following conscience. That's what gives this kind of solidarity its force. It's not ordered, it's earned. It arises from a sense of shared honor that doesn't require permission to stand up for what's right. The power of military solidarity is not loud by nature, but when it moves, it's unmistakable. It doesn't seek credit or attention, it seeks to restore balance. It reminds the world that behind every uniform is a person, behind every veteran a story, and behind every act of defense a promise that no one will be left behind. Public accountability through viral footage has become one of the most powerful checks on authority in the modern era. What used to rely on official reports, internal reviews, or witness statements can now unfold in real time through a single phone camera. When someone records an event like a police officer tossing a disabled veteran, that footage becomes more than evidence. It becomes a mirror reflecting how power is used, abused, and justified. The moment it's uploaded, it escapes the control of institutions and enters the hands of the public, where perception often moves faster than procedure. That speed can be uncomfortable for those in authority, but it's the only reason many stories ever see the light. The camera has become a civilian shield. It doesn't carry a weapon, it doesn't shout, it doesn't intervene, it simply watches. Yet that act of watching changes everything. It shifts power from those enforcing the law to those witnessing it. Before viral video culture, incidents involving misconduct were often silenced by paperwork and bureaucracy. Complaints disappeared, statements were edited, and narratives were shaped by official language. Now, when someone presses record, the truth becomes harder to bury. A shaky, unfiltered video can cut through polished press releases and expose reality in its rawest form. Viral footage forces accountability because it eliminates the luxury of denial. In the case of the disabled veteran, without that recording, it could have been written off as another non-compliant subject subdued. With it, people could see the limp, the confusion, the unnecessary escalation. They could hear the taser crack, see the body fall, and feel the imbalance of power play out second by second. Once that image spreads, no department statement can undo the visual truth. The footage becomes public property, replayed, analyzed, and shared until silence is no longer possible. Social media transforms that footage into a collective courtroom. Millions of viewers become witnesses, and their outrage turns into pressure. Politicians take notice, journalists dig deeper, and agencies scramble to explain themselves. The justice system might move slowly, but the internet doesn't. Viral footage accelerates exposure, forcing conversations that institutions try to delay. It demands not just answers, but accountability that's visible, not theoretical. That pressure doesn't always guarantee justice, but it does make neglect harder to hide. It brings power back to the people who were once voiceless. There's also a deeper psychological impact to seeing injustice on screen. Words can be debated, but images demand an emotional reaction. Watching a veteran collapse after being tossed doesn't invite speculation, it invites empathy. People might not understand policies or procedures, but they understand cruelty when they see it. Viral footage bypasses logic and goes straight to conscience. That emotional clarity is what forces communities to act, to speak out, and to demand change. It turns passive observers into participants in the pursuit of justice. Public accountability through viral media also exposes how fragile institutional credibility can be. When departments rush to defend their officers before investigating, the public sees the pattern of protection over truth. Every viral video becomes a case study in how power handles exposure. Some agencies double down and deny wrongdoing. Others admit fault only after backlash grows too loud to ignore. Either way, the footage reveals the character of institutions under pressure. It shows whether they value transparency or control. That choice shapes public trust more than any official statement ever could. The spread of viral footage has also reshaped journalism. News outlets no longer control the first narrative, they follow it. A video posted by a bystander can reach millions before any official source weighs in. That decentralization of information makes it harder for those in power to manipulate stories, but it also raises the stakes for truth. Every frame becomes a battleground of interpretation. Authorities may release edited clips, freeze frames, or alternative angles to sway perception, but the original, unfiltered footage almost always wins. The public's eyes have become the new lens of accountability. Still, the power of viral footage carries weight and risk. It can reveal truth, but it can also sensationalize. It can bring justice, but it can also trigger outrage faster than facts can catch up. Yet, even with its imperfections, it remains one of the few tools ordinary people have to challenge authority in real time. In a world where official narratives are crafted to protect institutions, the camera's eye doesn't care about rank or status. It captures what is, not what's claimed. That raw honesty is why viral footage matters. It levels the playing field between citizen and state. For the veteran in that highway moment, the video became his voice when he had none. It turned an isolated act of injustice into a national moment of reckoning. Without that recording, the story would likely have ended in a report, buried in bureaucracy. With it, people saw not just the act, but the pattern, the way power meets vulnerability, the way authority reacts when no one's supposed to be watching. The video forced a collective look at how accountability actually works, not in theory, but in practice. Public accountability thrives on visibility. When people can see injustice, they demand answers. When they demand answers, systems are forced to confront their failures. Viral footage doesn't just record reality, it reshapes it. It reminds those in power that their actions no longer happen in silence, that the age of hidden misconduct is ending, and that in the court of public opinion, truth doesn't need permission to be seen. The gap between law enforcement training and empathy is one of the most damaging flaws in modern policing. Officers are trained extensively in tactics, procedure, and control, but too little in understanding human behavior, trauma, or emotional distress. That imbalance creates a kind of tunnel vision where compliance is treated as the only acceptable outcome, and any deviation from it becomes a threat. When a disabled veteran is tossed for moving too slowly or not responding fast enough, it's not just an act of aggression. It's a symptom of a system that prioritizes authority over understanding. The absence of empathy in those moments turns protectors into enforcers and communities into battlegrounds. Police academies across the country emphasize physical readiness, legal knowledge, and tactical response. Recruits learn how to disarm suspects, manage crowd control, and handle high-stress confrontations. What they often don't learn is how to recognize fear, confusion, or disability in the people they encounter. The result is officers who can handle a weapon with precision but struggle to handle a conversation with compassion. That deficiency becomes dangerous when they encounter people who aren't acting normally, the mentally ill, the disabled, the elderly, or trauma survivors. Instead of adapting their approach, many default to commands and control because that's what they've been conditioned to do. Empathy is not weakness, it's awareness. It allows an officer to see the difference between defiance and distress. But empathy can't be developed in a weekend seminar or through a few hours of sensitivity training. It has to be built into the culture of policing from the start. That means teaching recruits not just how to enforce laws, but why people break them, how fear manifests in the body, and how trauma affects behavior. Without that understanding, every situation becomes a binary of obedience or resistance, and officers respond to both with force. The lack of emotional intelligence in law enforcement isn't just a personal failure, it's an institutional one. The gap between training and empathy is most visible in moments of misunderstanding. A disabled veteran crossing a highway may be moving slowly because of pain or limited mobility, but to an officer trained to read hesitation as defiance, that delay looks like noncompliance. The instinct becomes to assert control, not to inquire. Commands are barked, warnings are given, and within seconds, the situation escalates unnecessarily. That escalation isn't born from malice, it's born from conditioning. Officers are taught to manage threats, not people. When humanity is missing from the equation, even the smallest misstep can turn into violence. This gap also reveals how detached policing can be from the communities it serves. In many areas, officers are not locals. They don't know the people, the culture, or the struggles of the neighborhoods they patrol. That distance makes empathy even harder to access. Without personal connection, it's easier to see citizens as potential problems rather than as people. A veteran walking down the road isn't recognized as a neighbor or someone who sacrificed for the country. He's just another individual not following commands. The uniform becomes a barrier to understanding, and authority replaces relationship. The training model in most law enforcement agencies focuses on survival. Officers are repeatedly told that every encounter could be deadly, that hesitation can cost lives. That fear-based conditioning produces hypervigilance, which is useful in combat, but destructive in civilian policing. When fear drives behavior, empathy disappears. Every hand movement, every delay, every confused response is interpreted as a possible attack. That mindset turns everyday interactions into potential crises. The disabled veteran on the highway wasn't dangerous, but through the lens of fear-based training, he became a scenario to control, not a person to assist. Bridging the gap between training and empathy requires redefining what effective policing looks like. Success shouldn't be measured by arrests made or control maintained, but by conflicts avoided and trust earned. Officers need to be trained to slow down rather than escalate, to read context instead of reacting to reflex. De-escalation should be as essential as firearm training, and communication should be valued as much as command presence. Real safety doesn't come from dominance, it comes from understanding. But until empathy is treated as a core skill rather than an optional trait, tragedies like the tossing of a disabled veteran will keep happening. The absence of empathy in law enforcement is also tied to burnout and emotional detachment. Officers face constant stress, and many cope by numbing themselves to emotion. Over time, that desensitization seeps into how they treat others. Without regular psychological support and emotional education, empathy becomes a liability instead of a strength. The culture rewards toughness and punishes vulnerability, creating an environment where showing compassion can be seen as weakness. That mentality poisons the relationship between police and the public, replacing service with suspicion. The veteran's experience on that highway illustrates what happens when empathy is missing from every level of the system. An officer's split-second decision becomes a reflection of years of training that ignored human nuance. A simple situation becomes a flashpoint of violence, and a man who once wore a uniform of his own is treated like an enemy. The cost isn't just physical, it's moral. Every unnecessary act of force deepens the divide between authority and humanity. The gap between training and empathy is not inevitable, it's a choice. It's the result of priorities set by institutions that value compliance over connection. Closing that gap doesn't mean weakening law enforcement. It means strengthening its legitimacy. Empathy doesn't make officers vulnerable. It makes them wiser, more aware, more capable of preventing harm before it happens. But as long as policing is built on control instead of care, empathy will remain the missing skill that could have turned moments of violence into moments of understanding. The ripple effect of one act of injustice travels farther than anyone expects. It doesn't end with the victim or the officer or even the scene itself. It moves through communities, conversations, and institutions, changing how people see power, authority, and themselves. When a disabled veteran is tossed on a highway, it's not just an isolated incident. It becomes a symbol, a moment that exposes how fragile fairness really is. The footage spreads, outrage builds, and suddenly one act of violence becomes a national mirror reflecting what people fear about the systems meant to protect them. Injustice doesn't stay local anymore. It multiplies, amplified by every screen that shows it. The first ripple always hits those closest to the victim. Family and friends feel the shock first, watching someone they love turned into a headline or a viral clip. Their pain becomes public property, dissected by strangers who don't know the person behind the image. That kind of exposure adds another layer of trauma, as private grief becomes part of a larger social debate. The veteran's story stops being his alone. It becomes everyone's story, reshaped by opinion, by anger, by empathy, by outrage. The immediate circle of pain becomes the center of a storm that grows with every share, every repost, every conversation that starts with, "Did you see what happened?" The second ripple hits the community. People who once trusted authority begin to hesitate. They replay the footage and wonder if it could happen to them, to their parents, to their children. That uncertainty erodes the social fabric that keeps communities and law enforcement connected. Where there was cooperation, there's now suspicion. Each act of injustice plants seeds of doubt that take root quickly and are hard to remove. Even those who've never had a bad encounter start to view police differently. The badge begins to symbolize power unchecked rather than protection guaranteed. Then the third ripple reaches other officers. Some see the video and feel anger or shame, recognizing how one person's decision stains the reputation of many. Others grow defensive, retreating behind the shield of brotherhood, convinced that the public can't understand the stress of the job. Departments may close ranks instead of confronting the truth, choosing silence over accountability. That silence deepens the divide, fueling public anger and leaving good officers frustrated within a system too rigid to reform itself. The ripple spreads through the force, creating tension between conscience and loyalty, between truth and tradition. Beyond individuals and communities, the ripple expands into institutions. Politicians make statements, committees form, investigations begin. But most of these actions are reactive, not transformative. They respond to the noise rather than the cause. Policies get revised, body cameras get mandated, but the underlying culture remains unchanged. Real reform requires more than procedural updates. It demands a shift in values. Yet without sustained public pressure, the system often waits for outrage to fade. The ripple effect slows, but it never disappears. It lingers in the distrust that remains, in the quiet anger that resurfaces with the next injustice. Social media accelerates the ripple like never before. In the past, injustice could be contained by geography or bureaucracy. Now, a few seconds of video can cross continents within hours. What happens on a highway in one city becomes a global story. People in different countries see the same act and recognize a universal truth about power and vulnerability. That shared recognition builds momentum. It fuels movements, protests, and calls for accountability that transcend borders. But it also creates fatigue, as people are bombarded with images of suffering they can't stop. The ripple doesn't just move outward, it wears people down. There's another layer to the ripple, the psychological one. Every public act of injustice teaches people something about safety and silence. Some learn to record, to speak out, to demand better. Others learn to stay quiet, to keep their heads down, to protect themselves from becoming the next headline. The lesson people take depends on their position in society, their privilege, and their pain. But in every case, the act of injustice changes behavior. It shapes how people move through the world, how they trust authority, how they view justice itself. The ripple becomes part of their emotional landscape. Even those far removed from the event feel its echo through the media they consume and the conversations they join. It changes how children see uniforms, how veterans feel about the institutions they once served, how activists organize, and how citizens vote. Every injustice adds another layer to a collective awareness that refuses to fade. The more these moments accumulate, the harder it becomes to separate individual acts from systemic failure. People start to connect the dots, realizing that what looks like an isolated incident is part of a larger pattern that keeps repeating. The ripple effect also reaches inward, to those who caused the injustice. Officers who misuse power may face investigation, but they also face internal consequences that training can't address. Some feel guilt or fear, others double down on justification. Either way, their lives change too. Injustice contaminates everyone involved. It creates divisions within institutions, within communities, within individuals themselves. No one walks away untouched. The act may last seconds, but the consequences stretch for years, shaping careers, reputations, and public trust. The most powerful ripple of all is awareness. Once people have seen injustice, they can't unsee it. It alters their understanding of fairness and forces them to question the systems they rely on. That awareness can lead to activism, to reform, or to deeper cynicism, depending on how society responds. The tossing of a disabled veteran might start as a local story, but it becomes part of a much bigger conversation about humanity, authority, and accountability. The ripple keeps moving, not because people choose to remember, but because the impact refuses to fade. Respect and protection owed to those who served is more than a social expectation. It's a moral obligation that defines how a nation values its defenders. Veterans carry the physical and psychological weight of service long after they leave the battlefield. They return home changed, often wounded in ways that can't be seen, and they rely on the promise that their country will honor their sacrifice with dignity, care, and understanding. When a disabled veteran is tossed on the side of a highway by those sworn to protect, that promise shatters. It isn't just a personal violation, it's a betrayal of national values. The uniform that once symbolized duty becomes a reminder of abandonment. Respect is not ceremonial, it's practical. It's about how veterans are treated in daily life, not just during parades or on holidays. True respect means patience, awareness, and compassion from the institutions they help defend. Many veterans live with disabilities, trauma, or conditions that affect their mobility, speech, and behavior. Those realities require sensitivity, not suspicion. Yet too often, the very systems built to protect civilians fail to recognize that veterans, too, are civilians now, ones who deserve a level of care informed by what they've endured. When authority figures treat them as threats instead of citizens, it reveals how hollow the words, "Thank you for your service," can sound when not backed by action. Protection owed to veterans extends beyond physical safety. It includes emotional security, social reintegration, and fair treatment by law enforcement and public institutions. Many veterans struggle to navigate civilian life, facing homelessness, unemployment, and untreated mental health issues. These struggles make them more visible to police, but not more dangerous. The problem lies in misunderstanding. Without training to recognize the signs of PTSD or physical disability, officers may interpret a veteran's hesitation, confusion, or defensive reaction as aggression. The result is tragedy born from ignorance, not intent. But ignorance does not excuse harm. The duty to protect includes the duty to understand. Respecting those who served also means recognizing their continued contribution to society. Veterans embody resilience, discipline, and sacrifice, values that should inspire trust, not fear. When they're treated unjustly, The message sent to all service members is that their loyalty is one-sided, that their service earns gratitude in words but neglect in practice. That message erodes morale and widens the gap between military and civilian worlds. It tells soldiers that while their courage is celebrated on the battlefield, it's disposable once they return home. The highway incident becomes more than an act of police misconduct. It becomes a reflection of how quickly society forgets its heroes when the cameras aren't rolling. The obligation to protect veterans is woven into the identity of a just society. It is not charity, but repayment. Every veteran has already paid a price most civilians never will: time, safety, and often peace of mind. They should never have to fear those who represent the same government they once served. Respecting them means ensuring that systems of power treat them with the care they've earned. That care isn't limited to medical benefits or ceremonies. It's shown through empathy in moments of vulnerability, restraint in moments of confusion, and support in moments of crisis. The treatment of veterans by law enforcement reveals much about a nation's conscience. A society that honors its protectors with parades but allows them to be mistreated in the streets is performing respect, not practicing it. Genuine protection requires training, awareness, and accountability. Officers should be taught to identify veteran status and respond accordingly, to approach with understanding instead of authority. A simple question, "Are you a veteran?" can change an entire encounter. It shifts tone, de-escalates tension, and reminds both sides that they share allegiance to the same flag. There's also a cultural aspect to this respect. Veterans often carry a sense of identity rooted in service and sacrifice. When they're treated harshly or with indifference, it strikes deeper than an ordinary confrontation. It's not just a personal insult. It's a negation of everything they stood for. The man tossed on the highway wasn't just another civilian. He was someone who once swore to defend the same nation that failed to defend him. That irony burns deep, and it resonates with every veteran who sees the footage and recognizes themselves in his place. Public respect for veterans has to go beyond symbolism. Communities need to engage with them, understand their needs, and integrate them into civilian life in meaningful ways. Law enforcement agencies, hospitals, and public institutions should treat them not as outsiders, but as part of the civic fabric they help protect. This means investing in training, mental health awareness, and community partnerships that ensure veterans are met with empathy, not enforcement. Respect without understanding is empty. Protection without awareness is ineffective. The protection owed to veterans is also about setting an example for future generations. How a nation treats its former soldiers teaches young people what service is worth. If veterans are respected, young men and women see that sacrifice is honored. If they're mistreated or forgotten, service loses its meaning. Each act of disrespect or neglect becomes a warning that loyalty might not be returned. The incident on the highway shows why this conversation matters. It forces society to confront whether its gratitude for veterans is sincere or selective. Respect and protection are not favors to be granted, but debts to be paid. Veterans shouldn't have to fight for dignity after already fighting for their country. They shouldn't be tossed, ignored, or misunderstood because institutions lack the humanity to see the person behind the uniform. True respect means creating a culture where no veteran has to fear those in power, where service is honored not just with words, but with understanding, care, and unwavering protection every single day.